Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. This is Margaret Mitchell, and I am really excited today to be able to join you for a conversation around livable wage. Livable wage is going to be a key theme for our Stand Against Racism Challenge when we kick off later this year. And today we really wanted to have an opportunity just to be able to give you some broad directional conversation about livable wage. And joining me today is Dr. Amy Glassamer. She is the MIT professor who developed and was one of the co-creators of the MIT livable wage nearly 20 years ago, I believe in 2004, but she'll correct me. And also joining us is our executive director, our CEO from Metropolitan Phoenix YWCA, Debbie Esperanza. And so Debbie and Dr. Glassamer are so delighted to have you both.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
My pleasure.
You know, I have to say that, you know, when we think about livable wage, and I've been fascinated by livable wage, minimum wage for quite some time. And it's almost shocking for me to recognize that the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage as we know it today, really is established at the end of the 30s. And at that time, I believe it was 25 cents. And here we are in 2022. Right? So not quite 90 years, but we're approaching that. And that wage federally has moved from 25 cents to $7.25. Dr. Glassamer, you're a professor in geography and regional planning. What is it about the livable wage that drove you to create this calculator nearly 20 years ago? And how do we reconcile that the minimum wage is not linked to inflation? I don't understand why it just isn't linked to inflation.
Well, that's a really important question, and a lot of our social indicators are actually not adjusted for inflation. And even if we were to use inflation indicators, we don't have geographically specific enough estimators to really essentially even out the variation in the cost of living. So it doesn't mean we don't have the data, doesn't mean we don't know how to calculate it. It is that there's ways in which we don't have the resources that are actually dedicated to truly understanding the lived experience of people. I want to go to your initial point about the minimum wage. So the minimum wage was created in the Roosevelt administration. And during the time when it was being negotiated through Congress, the argument in the East was to have it be a 40-cent minimum wage. And the Southern Democrats of the time were advocating for 25 cents. And in the end, the only way that he could get it passed was if he made the whole country the same. And that's one of the things that we've lived with ever since, right? So we all know that the cost of living varies enormously across the country. And we do have mechanisms for getting estimates of that. But the political consequences have always been ones that we know we need to do it, but we also have anxiety about the political consequences. You know, will people still stay together when we essentially represent reality in its true form? But when we created the tool, it happened to be right at the end of the 2001 recession. And we were doing a project for the Ford Foundation at the time, re-examining poverty policy. And I, as a data analyst, had seen the trajectory from the 60s to 2010, and I could tell that the federal spending in the Great Society days actually had a huge impact on the poorest parts of the United States. And so I felt like the policy hadn't failed. What I felt was we didn't invest enough and we didn't stay the course long enough. And so the tool was built for policymakers who are faced in communities where their major employers were essentially shutting down. And this was the beginning of the real clear effect of globalization. And so manufacturing jobs in the textiles and apparel, in the labor intensive manufacturing types of work were essentially leaving the country. And individual political leaders were dealing with problems of, tens of thousands of people being unemployed. And they didn't really know what to do about it. They thought that, well, the wage rate will sort of settle and then new employers will come into place. But it assumes new employers are going to come, and they weren't going to come, and the wages weren't going to fall. And so they needed to put in backstops so that families didn't fall through the cracks. And we built branch plant closure programs to try to get social services to focus on families in communities where the biggest declines took place. So that's what it started as. And over its lifetime, it's been Ann Landers. It's been, a place for people to kind of feel like they're not crazy. It's also been a place to help people interested in changing policies. Big cities have used changes in the minimum wage more actively than probably any geographic unit. And today is a very interesting time. If you ask me who I answer all the mail, and I get 4 or 5, sometimes 10 particular emails a day. And most of the time today, it's about employers. And they're asking me about what it is, how should they do it, who else is doing it. And they're also asking, well, if I can't do it now, how do I do something? And I'll give them advice about increasing benefits, making adjustments and things which they can do prior to paying taxes so that it has a very different effect on the bottom line. So that's really the legacy.
Wow, what a powerful story. And for those of us joining who have not been familiar or are familiar with the tool, you can find it online. You can either Google MIT Livable Wage Calculator. I think the exact www address on the net is Livable Wage. Is it MIT Livable Wage?
It's livingwage.mit.edu.
But if you Google any combination of that,
that's right,
we'll go right there. It's a very useful, user-friendly tool. You'll be able to go to your state. Once you're in your state, you'll be able to look for your particular county. And there, over the years, I've really seen the tool really become quite accurate in looking at expenses. It certainly is not perfect, as expenses do vary widely, family to family, person to person, but you get a really good workable sense. And it is a very strong tool to be able to understand what so much you feel in your gut, what you think it is that you know. And the tool really lays it out in a really beautiful way. So I hope that you will familiarize yourself with the tool. Debbie, I want to turn to you because as a sister in the association, you have been looking at this issue. And I wanted to ask you sort of what drove you, or what were some of the reasons that caused you to take a look at your base hourly pay? Where were you? Where are you now? Where do you hope to be? And what were some of those driving forces?
Thanks for asking, Margaret. And thanks, Dr. Glassinger, for the tool you've created. Can't wait to see if I'm close to getting closer to the right answer, if there is a right answer. I've been CEO here for about 3 years, and coming in, one of the major programs we run is a Meals on Wheels or senior meals program. And our frontline workers, our kitchen staff and our drivers, at that point, were at minimum wage, which was just around $10 an hour. Arizona has since moved minimum wage to $12 an hour, which, at first we're going like, okay, that's going to be a jump to the budget. I mean, in most budgets, it's not unique to YWCAs, but nonprofits and other organizations, payroll and related expenses is generally about well, it's the largest expense, but for us, it's about half of our $2 million budget. And so it's not something you take lightly just to move it up. But what really crossed my mind was, it was the right thing to do, given who we are as an organization. The lowest paid workers were people of color and women. And these folks on my team had the longest seniority. So these folks have been with us for 10, 12, 15 years, and we're still paying them on the lowest end of the scale. So it moved up to $12 an hour in Arizona. Shortly thereafter, I moved their wage to $14 an hour. And then my intention is next fiscal year to move them to $15 an hour. But really, what made me decide was I felt we had to put our walk where our talk was, and so that the individuals working with us and for us and delivering our mission related programs could feel that the mission lived in them as well. So it was a mission moment for me, really to move that.
What was the scariest part for you in thinking about making that leap and, the commitment to not only sustaining that, but continuing to grow that over time to keep pace and to come to a level of parity around a livable wage?
Well, those folks that know me really well know that, I look at the math first, and then I try to undo just thinking about the math. Because there's so many other things to consider. But the math was a little over $60,000 on my little organization. And, when I'm looking at growth and thinking about perhaps another full-time equivalent to do marketing or advancement or some of those other things, the scary part was I invested in our frontline workers and delayed additional investment in capacity for infrastructure. I think I'll be able to catch up both coming this year. So, but the scariness, I do work from a place of abundance, and I'm confident it will come. But I know how much it's going to cost, and so that meant I didn't have to be as scared because I could name the number, and I knew that it wasn't an unknown. And that I could then build it into the planning, not only for when it got implemented, but as we go further.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Glassmer, I bet this isn't an unfamiliar conversation. There often is a feeling of overwhelmingness for small businesses, certainly for nonprofits, who our revenue streams are complex, and often we're not the sole driver of those revenue mechanics year in and year out. And so there is on some a real, not just on nonprofits or not just the YWCA, but certainly an overwhelming feeling in the country that a livable wage, a $15 an hour wage, which is something that's been settled on as aspirational in many parts of the country, feels burdensome. And yet there is some data there to the contrary, isn't there?
You mean in terms of the consequences?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was going to ask Ms. Esparraza, when you made this decision, did you notice that your colleagues were happier and they had a slightly lighter step and they had a more can-do attitude and they wanted to step up and do more problem solving and wanted you to know that they really appreciated you?
Well, yes, they did. And more importantly, or in addition to that, they felt seen and they felt embraced and cared for. I also had this part of the conversation with our exempt staff who, everybody wants a little more money in their paycheck. And I said, let's have this conversation as a full team. We're making this investment for our frontline workers, which means I may need to delay, other movements until I can, balance it all. And, first it's, but then I said, well, let's talk about the equity. Let's talk about what this really means. And then everybody said, oh yeah, that's the right thing to do. I can wait a little bit, so that I could see that I could, fill the budget, and then we could go from there. So it wasn't just an impact on our drivers and kitchen team, but it was an impact on the entire organization to know that they were helping to make the space for us to make this decision, and everyone was supporting it. So,
And
yes,
your comments, as a person who studies economics, I mean, in the end, what you probably experienced was an increase in productivity. I mean, people didn't have to, be worried. We always run multiple stories in our heads, right? We're never having a single conversation with ourselves. And when you can unburden from the fact that you have something in 2 weeks that are going to cause you to have to juggle something, people's productivity has been demonstrably seen to change. And so that's why it's a no-brainer, quite frankly. And it's a real disappointment, I think, for many people, because they realize they're worth more because they are worth more, and they give more every single day. And you actually, I think, are really powerful in giving everybody the understanding of why we do these things. We don't do them because it's, and People Magazine. We do it because we've actually really felt the value of the people around us, and we recognize that we can work together and have a really big impact. And I see that's part of the conversations I have with really big corporations, like hundreds of thousands of people, and they are looking at exactly the population you're describing. And they're basically saying that yes, it is scary. It's even scary for big places, but they get rewarded immediately because the angst, the uncertainty, and actually the sense of pride and value are things which people experience.
Thank you. I'll mention too that one of the other things that we took a look at was expanding the availability for benefits. There was a classification in our system that did not include these folks in our time off and our vacation and some of those types of things. This was a decision made decades ago. And so we changed the classification. And now they're eligible for, it's prorated still, most of them are part-time, but they're eligible for time off, for vacation. Of course, during COVID, we were very flexible with sick time or time that you needed to attend to yourself or your family. And also, we've just made sure that everyone understands that it's not about being full-time or part-time, but for YWCA in specific, our retirement plan is very handsome. And they had not really been fully briefed on the fact that they're a part of the retirement plan. And that made them all very happy because they were getting papers that said numbers. And they said, you mean that's my money? Like, you're not going to take it? The organization, like, no, that's your money. And so they were just like thrilled. But yes, it was a full conversation with everybody. The other example for the time off, it had been a tradition here prior to my coming here that, again, the exempt staff, for lack of a better definition, got as a gift the week between Christmas and New Year's. Well, our meals program has to work that week. They don't get to have off. And so I had a chat with all of us and said, that's not fair. That's not equitable. Please don't ask to just be gifted this time. You have, vacation time you could take. I'm very flexible with that, but please don't ask to be gifted. We're already on the higher level of the salary scale in our organization. Let's not us ask for something that we can't make available to the entire organization. So as we progress, we're going to continue to find ways to change the schedule for how the meals get delivered during that time, but we can't not provide frontline worker support for all they do in our community. So those conversations were engaging. I'm just going to say engaging and eye-opening for everyone.
So, one thing that happens to me a lot is people ask me where in an organization the wage rate is set. And I have to tell you that most of the time they think that it's the CEO of the corporation that's making this decision. And when it's corporate and I'm dealing with that question, I go, do you realize how far away the corporate leader is from that particular question? It's the person who's got to worry about the stuff getting out the door every day. And that's where those decisions are made. And I said, and you need to realize that they are watching carefully as they can to be able to exercise the influence they have to make it better for people. And but it's always interesting that we have these, I wouldn't even say it's misunderstanding. It's like misperceptions of where does power reside and how do we activate power on behalf of people that we work with. And I would say that your experience, Ms. Esparza, is really important to share with your colleagues because it is scary. I mean, I answer that question a lot. I'd like to do it, so says somebody, but I don't know how to do it. And I said, well, how about if you do it and do the math backwards and see what the outcome is? I said, you don't have to do it. Just do the exercise of figuring it out. How would you do it? Would you change your suppliers? Would you find some cooperative supply mechanism? Would you, alter some other means? You said you changed your benefits. I mean, there's so many ways for us to actually alter the lived experience of people. And there's some ways in which I feel we don't allow ourselves the privilege, but also the right to think about that. Right? It's partly you got to think about it and then do the math and work backwards and talk to your colleagues because it is, and particularly for women, even as a boss, I've been a boss, I've been a head of a department, I've run a lot of different things, but there is always this kind of nagging feeling, is this my right? Should I be doing this? And my view is, it is your right, it is your responsibility, and it's your opportunity. And I really, you maybe do a training on how do you account to create a living wage.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, please just call me Debbie. Esparza is not the easiest name to roll off your tongue, so just call me Debbie. But I agree with you. It took me a little while to get my courage up. Again, after I did the math, and at the risk of moving too far down the conversation, one of the first things I did when I did the math was talk to my primary funder and said, you're going to see me asking for some more money because I want to pay these folks more and I want to shift this. And I am not kidding. On the Zoom call, the contract administrator of our largest contract said, I'm so happy to hear that. You got it. And so they haven't balked. They know I'm going to ask for the other dollar next year as we go through our next iteration. But I tend to be pretty transparent and pretty authentic with all my, hopefully with all my dealings, and particularly with our funding partners, because I don't want them to think something, but the moral to that story is they're just as proud that we've asked for the money and that we're spending it in this way as I am to be able to walk our talk and live our mission. And, maybe make life a little bit easier for some of our teams.
I'm sitting here nodding my head because, when I was the director of the YWCA in Cleveland, we moved our minimum from $7 and some change to $15 in 2016. And at that time, the conversation, particularly with small and large companies, was very, very different. I was sitting here nodding my head because I too was, I was very afraid, very worried, but began embedding it in everything we do. And Dr. Glassamer, I think that you are correct in that it's important for us. And I want those joining us today to know that we want to be able to continue this conversation. And for those associations who are interested in maybe having a small group discussion with Debbie and other leaders around the country that have made this move to really look at the numbers, the budgeting, the conversations, and to gain some skill in this area. So thank you both. There is a great question though related to the benefits cliff that can happen when you do move. And I know that this was something that I know we saw in Cleveland. So you're able to move the hourly base wage, and for many it will bump them up against the benefits cliff. I know that for some that could mean, hey, we were working part-time or we were working at the federal minimum and we're eligible for a child care subsidy, or it could be something else, but we'll use child care in this conversation. And now my salary is at the level in which I'm no longer eligible. And yet the full price of childcare at $2,000 a month is just as unaffordable for me. And so that is a real challenge that is created when the livable wage, and I'm not at all saying that $15 is a livable wage in Cleveland, Ohio, but it did create a real challenge.
That it's also it does, and I was commenting before the show that I gave I talked with the social arm of the National Bar Association, and somebody asked me that question, and I my reaction was, yeah, it's really important for people to understand how that happens and what, if anything, there is that you can do to mitigate it. And because when we increment income, it's never going to be the equivalent of an extra $1,000 for childcare. And so that really becomes one of these circumstances where we have to think creatively, sometimes outside the box of the wage, so that the individual still has the progress, but not the penalty. And, it's really unfortunate because the truth is we're not caring for ourselves. We're not caring for the people around us. And when I talk to people individually, I never have somebody that says, oh, that person just doesn't deserve that. What I hear is really more an uncertainty about the whole world. It's like, the world is changing so rapidly, and I'm not sure what I should be doing myself. And yet we have to maintain. I really appreciate all the commentary on your websites, which I looked around at, is having that language about support and also the language about rights. We're at a period right now where rights are challenged in lots of ways that I in my lifetime never expected. And we need to both figure out how to respond, and we also need to figure out ways to communicate gently, not forcefully, but gently, clearly that there are things we have to do to be a healthy and happy society.
Yeah, wage is a real driver in terms of our work to bring racial and gender equity in our lifetime. And it's not the only tool, it's not the only driver, but I believe that it is just a really main factor, a main force in being able to advance gender and racial equity in our lifetime. Not the only tool, but just a real driver. And it has been a real harm for women, and particularly women of color. We haven't even talked about the tip wage, which is also just as fascinating to me. And I think minimum wage, for so long we thought, oh, this is, what high school students earn when they are, when they have a summer job. And yet we know that huge swaths of the United States, I've seen, is it 30 or almost nearly 40% are working at an hourly rate?
It, it depends on, yeah, it's about that. If you put them all together, because they're in all sorts of parts, right? You've got agriculture workers, you've got food service workers, but it's not an inconsequential portion of our population. It's about 10%.
And the way we see women and their roles and how they are, working at an entry level, it seems like a permanent entry level for women and too often women of color specifically. It really is this public policy that is impacting poverty. And you said, you were doing some work around reexamining poverty and policy. And that is so fascinating to understand all of those impacts and what's really in there, because wage is certainly a driver, would you say?
It is a driver. I think that you were right when you said we just kind of went along for a long time thinking that the minimum wage was a part of the world, but it wasn't part of our world. And it became a part for many more persons, really, and also women, and also particularly women of color. And, we used to have more rights as workers. We used to have more defense as workers, and we don't right now. And so we have to actually rebuild and realign so that we feel it is our right to say that if we work hard, we should be able to live on the wage that you're earning. And, Americans are incredibly stoic. I think of the people I know, then the things that they've done and what they've put up with. And we're remarkably stoic. We're almost fatalistic. And I think this is a very confusing time because, we just came out of a big recession, and then all of a sudden we have this pandemic. And, at one point, a huge job loss, but we had the CARES Act, and we had for the first time this amazing amount of money that was put into people's pockets to compensate for their immediate loss of jobs. And you know what happened? That money made almost everyone in America whole.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it, $600 a week per person times 4. If you were a single mom, for the first time in your life, you felt whole. And I was hoping that, the political leaders would see that and say, you know what, we are so far off, we're crazy. But that's not what happened. But it was an experiment. And when we calculate and account for that, we're going to be able to say without question that the majority of Americans who could not pay their bills paid all of their bills for the first time in probably 40 years. And so we know what it's going to take. And it's not going to be small, but inch by inch and step by step, that and like Debbie, she just decided that's what she was going to do, and she was going to figure it out, and she brought the whole gang along. And you're lucky you have an organization of empathetic and genuinely generous people, because it's going to be a lot easier than if you're in a remote from where the boss is and remote where the decisions are made. But I really encourage this idea of presenting the knowledge necessary to figure out how you increment. Don't all try to do it at once. If you try to drink from a fire hose, you'll be just like the students at MIT, sleeping all the time when they're not working hard. But I do think that's extremely important, because it's not something you get, even in business school. You don't get it unless you do HR.
Yeah, and I would add, this is definitely not perfect. And we really, the entire team, we try to hold that we're not after perfection, we're after progress. And so just keep moving a little bit further, right? And what else do we need to look at? How do we need to iterate this or generate this? Whatever the change is, that we don't get just one chance at it. We can try it again if it didn't hit the mark that we're looking for. So progress, not perfection.
I want to ask both of you, our mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. How can we advocate for a livable wage? Or can we advocate for a livable wage and still be in the infancy of doing this work internally? How do we both have a voice externally and be able to work with our teams to let them know that we're in the readying phase to get ready, we're taking this seriously, we know we need to move, but haven't yet? How can we still advocate publicly?
So my experience is there are many, many leaders in communities, and they're doing their part in their way where they are, but they're not often brought together around a topic like this. They're brought together around things like increase in crime, changes in temperature, or perhaps something like a pandemic, but they're not really brought together to talk about how do we move forward in making lives easier for people by understanding exactly how valuable they are. And I think you because you're leaders and you know other leaders, it's about having these coffee experiences, right? Where you say, hey, we're going to do a talk on X. Debbie could actually do it for her organization, but she could also do it for her neighborhood, her organizations around her, and say, you know what we did? We went to this talk, and this talk was pretty interesting. It turned out you might be able to do something with it. And you just sort of share it with people. And there are a lot of people that actually like to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And it feels very good when you actually come out with a little bit extra that you can do something with. So I think it's really one of these most powerful grassroots issues because everybody knows somebody who's not making it. Let me just cite a statistic for you. 97% or 312 million Americans, that's 70% or 226 million Americans live in counties where the living wage is at least $2.50 higher than the minimum wage. 70%. You're not alone. You couldn't find somebody who wasn't in that situation. Mm-hmm. And it's those sort of powerful statistics which really gets you to be able to say to somebody, so, you know, you don't have to be embarrassed about making that much money because nobody's making that much money. And how do we work together and learn how to do that? Because it is that big a deal. It's that many people. And we don't say that to each other, but you're leaders, and I think that's where it counts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
If I could interject, you saw me giggling a little bit. When I was invited to this conversation, my dilemma was that at this very same time, we're hosting our own local webinar with two local colleagues, and the name of the webinar or learning series is called Know Your Worth, Navigating the Wage Gap. And so thank you for the suggestion. We are doing it.
We're doing it.
In addition to our meals program, the other direct service we do is financial education. And this particular conversation is focused, today's conversation was focused on students, particularly because they probably are looking at entry level or part-time jobs to get them through. So we're talking about wages, and we're talking about managing student debt and scholarships and kind of how to manage all these things when you're in college, so that, you know, the next steps, you've got a little more more tools in your toolbox. But I'm just sitting here giggling that, yeah, good idea. I love that idea.
You had it already.
You can't start too soon. You know, with these conversations, and they're awkward sometimes, particularly in families. You know, I come from a Latino family, and we didn't talk about money. And I remember, this is a little bit off point, but I remember, you know, my folks worked really hard to send me to school, and I, you know, went right into a career. When I first realized that I made more money than my father, I was cautioned by some people in the family saying, that's going to hurt his feelings. That's going to hurt his Latino ego. But the opposite was true. My father was so very proud because he could see the work that he had put in to create the space for me to prosper was happening. But that, they're talking about livable wage and family finances and women who might have to run the household. Those conversations with their kids, with their extended family, those are also really critical as far as overall prosperity and economic growth by generation. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but staying in the present, livable wage, creating a more valuable space for people to work in, a caring space. I'm thinking of the people that I know in my circles, at the grocery store, or at the restaurants, or again, on my staff that work 2 jobs to make ends meet. And I can't imagine that. And I've been so very blessed to not have to worry about that. But I think about that and how they juggle their lives. And I think it's my responsibility to help mitigate that a bit. And that is what draws me to this work. And we had the tangent on the mission, but it's not just about the livable wage. It's about how do families talk about money. And money is like the biggest stressor for most people, no matter where you're at on the salary scale. It doesn't matter how much you make, you probably still think it's not quite enough to make your ends meet. And that creates some of the mental stress that we're all feeling, the isolation, I'm all by myself, I have to do this by myself. So it trickles down to all those other things that impact us as a community. So
I want to tell you about a tool that the state of Maine education I guess it's a trust or it's a foundation. They built a little tool for kids from like 7 years old to 15. And it's a game that the children play, and it's about budgeting. And it comes in a box, and kids make their budgets, and they start out making their budgets. And of course, one kid wants a Camaro, a bright cherry red Camaro, right? But then they've got all these other expenses they have to go through. And they use this tool to teach budgeting and finance to children. Well, one of the things that I was told when I learned about this program was that the kids go home and they teach their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just this nice little box of tool, pieces of paper basically. And but it should start at that level so that our children aspire and at the same time learn sort of self-control, because that's the big thing, right? Is saving and then occasionally spending, but not spending all the time and occasionally saving.
Yeah.
I can't believe how fast the time is going. I love what both of you have said. And I think as a network, it really is important to understand that livable wage connects powerfully to our mission. And that even when we ourselves have not started the work within our own organizations, we can have the dialogue in the community. And that is the investment we are making in others. It's also an investment we are making in ourselves, because we are having this dialogue, which I hope you will have both internally and in the community through the challenge in 2022. It really does help us support that growth and movement for everyone. It is a piece in which this is a tool in which we can empower women. This is a tool in which we can look at how we will eliminate racism. Livable wage is one of those needle moving tools. So we are at 45 past the hour, and there are a number of really great questions. And so I want to get to one of the questions that was asked earlier. And the question is, I noticed looking at the calculator that the livable wage for 2 adults with children and with one working, I think they were trying to sort of rectify why the calculator was different in that calculation of 2 working adults versus 1 working adult. And I know that it really is a state by state, county by county. I don't know what state they were looking at. But how would you answer that question? Is this because the cost of childcare is actually higher than the cost of another adult to live, eat, etc., as a part of the household?
That's right. So if one person is earning income and there's a child and one person is staying at home, the costs for that wage is borne completely by that first individual. But if you have 2 adults working with a child in childcare, then the wage rate for the 2 adults isn't the same as the first adult working by themselves, right? So it's the sum of the income for a single person, or it's 2 times the value for the household where both adults are working.
Thank you. I see someone commenting that, we have to really employ our trauma-informed lens when we're discussing personal finance. And I think absolutely. I think we have to use our trauma-informed lens at all times. And I also think that we need to continue to acquire a racialized trauma-informed lens that will inform us even further.
I completely agree with that. I did work with the psychological health for the Marines and the Navy during Iraq and Afghanistan. And I worked alongside of individuals who were trauma trained. I didn't even know what that meant. But my job was to try to figure out why people were committing suicide. And I watched these professionals working on these problems, and it was a very different way of understanding the world and a very different form of compassion than I'd ever seen. So I really believe that's a very important part of the world we live in today. And there's absolutely a shortage of that.
I don't want to stay stuck on the fear of raising the minimum wage, but it's still baffled to me that we haven't had an increase since 2009. I don't quite understand why. And at the same time, it is encouraging to see so many companies, large and small, making moves and decisions for themselves and their employees and the country. But why the hesitancy at the federal level to move? It almost feels as if sort of an automatic mechanism, to me, tied to the Federal Reserve, which is, regionally able to, identify and pulls big levers around the economy and inflation. That's how I think about the Federal Reserve. And I'm always baffled. Why aren't we tied to the Federal Reserve Bank for the federal minimum? And why hasn't it been raised since 2009?
Well, the answer is because it's related to the White House and who's in the White House. So nobody wants to be the president that causes the cost of living to go up, or to find themselves having to speak to corporate leaders about the fact that this is the right thing to do. It's really important for us to realize that some of the most active social policy around wages took place in the Johnson, in the Nixon eras, and even Ronald Reagan did some such social policies that we sort of didn't see happen. But we've been in an era since Bill Clinton, when he took away, as we saw, welfare as they thought. We basically demonized a lot of the way of thinking necessary to accept that the nation needs to take responsibility for the care of people. And we're vacillating back and forth right now with many, many challenges. But the bottom line is, you don't want to be the president who raises the minimum wage. You really don't. And so, we're now facing a divided Congress. So here is Joe Manchin, senator from a poor state in Appalachia, and he is wishing not to continue the child credits that are making it possible for children to have food and extra clothing and things that they need. Now, as a leader of a low income state, it would seem to me that I would want to hop on the horse with everybody else and just ride along. But it's not how we think about things in America. We actually, we think of ourselves as not worthy. That's my view.
That hit you over the head.
But I do think that, you know, you commented that you're seeing wages change where you are. I mean, I drove into Taco Bell one day and they had a $17.25 an hour job for somebody who was going to wear the mic. And I just sat there and I first off, I gave the person $2 and I said, look at what's happening here. And then they looked at me like completely shocked. And I said, do you realize how much progress has been made in the last 2 years? A doubling plus of the minimum wage for what you're going to get paid. And it was this person, it dawned on them. It was like, wow, that's what happened. So, you know, this is sort of like sometimes policy gets made in America. It starts at the local level and people just do what they think is necessary. And then eventually some strange moment occurs and then we all kind of go together. But I don't think, one thing I do feel pretty strongly about is wages are pretty sticky going down. So getting out of where we are now is going to be pretty hard to do. And as we're seeing, employees are basically saying, if what you're going to do is pay me $7.25, I'd rather find another way to solve my problem than doing that job because it's a demeaning job. People say here that people saying that more and more. You know, I had to take the trash out 25 times a day in a restaurant. That's a pretty demeaning job when it's me in a 50-pound bag of stuff and I do it 25 times and you're paying me $7.25. So I think, you know, we have to just believe it's possible and keep on talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Believe it's possible.
Well, hopefully I can make this point quickly, but to what Dr. Glassenberg just said, my first job, which was a long, long time ago, and at minimum wage, my boss made me understand or helped me understand that my work was critical, absolutely necessary for all the customers in that bank to be happy with that bank. And I thought, oh, I can't do my job wrong. I have, you know, no matter how many times I had to take out the trash or whatever the menial part I was doing, it was me being part of those customers being happy with this organization. So that's also a part of what's happening in our kitchen and our drivers. We celebrate them and the impact that they're making in the community. We ask about the testimonies and the things that they experienced during the day. And we say, that person has a better life because you made them that meal, because you delivered it and you listened to them. Same with our prosperity programs. We're listening to them and really finding out how can we push those levers with them. But what you said is really just everybody in the organization needs to understand their value to the organization, and the organization, you know, slowly but surely needs to show that value in return. And so that's how it shows up here sometimes. And again, progress, not perfection. We're not there yet.
Great saying. I'm going to say that to my students because they always, you know, they get themselves tangled up in emotional turmoil because I didn't get a perfect score. And I look at them, I said, there's only one perfect person that can get the perfect score because it's on a sliding scale. So if you don't get it, it doesn't mean you didn't try. It just means it wasn't your turn, you know, and so I really think your comments are right. I also would say that we have to recognize that the corporate world changed in the last 40 years. It was possible 40 years ago to be working alongside of somebody who was the vice president for a huge corporation like General Electric and have that person who had worked their way up off the floor. But it isn't that way anymore, right? We've got kids going to business school. They're learning how to manipulate the world in the way that makes a lot of money, but it isn't necessarily taking all the care that's required. So we're not dealing in the same world as we were before, but we still do have an influence over the world that we're close to. And the more we project those kind of vibes, and the more we give people a sense of value, the more we can count on them feeling that way. which is really important for human existence.
There's a question about how often you can raise wages for a worker. And Debbie, I'd also like to hear from you sort of what you, where you tie it to, what threads you tie it to. But Dr. Glassamer, your thoughts on how often we can raise wages for workers?
Well, it used to be that you got a wage increase every year, right? Might have not been a whole lot, but you got a wage rate. And your wage went up and then it plateaued. And then you sort of stayed in that job for a really long time. That's not how it works anymore. There's sort of multiple levels in the labor market, right? So there's primary jobs that have good benefits and good pay and consistent raises, and there's secondary jobs, and they are uncertain, they don't pay good wages, and they're highly variable. And that happens in periods where there's a lot of flux in the economy at large, and also when technological change is causing the way that we worked before to actually be different than it is today. And then add globalization, in which you are finding that it's easy for somebody to find low wages and high skills in other parts of the world. Well, you know, that knocks the socks off of many people, even if they try very hard. Mm-hmm. So on average, it used to be there was something about an annual increase, right? That's how we made our life's quest and our job until we retired. What I would say is that you don't want to see wage rates increasing excessively above some level beyond the cost of living. You've got to be able to have some change in wages so that people's standards of living evolve. That's our problem. We've got a whole lot of people that have had almost no change in their standard of living. We have not produced quality jobs. And so people are stuck underneath that wall, that sort of ceiling. And what we need to do is to revalue people. There was an article in the New York Times that said that 70% of Americans are better, smarter, and more capable than they're being paid. And this was a very profound statement. And it was basically suggesting that we're getting a good deal. And maybe we should rearrange the good deal so that people actually are feeling the good deal, not just giving the good deal away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and quickly, we do look at about an annual, we look at our salaries annually, and that's because the system of the government grants and the fundraising that we do. So we're all about bumping up against those systems and changing them up. But right now we are in an annual cycle. For many of our jobs or our roles, I look at market rates, particularly for our exempt staff. I look for market rates to set the salary ranges. And if I bring someone in at the lower end of that market rate, at the 6-month level, I have, if it's warranted, I have a salary conversation, particularly if they're bringing more value than I saw when I first interviewed and hired. I want to keep that person. But I try to hit the market rate. And for those folks that are being paid by my contracts, it really is annually, unless they take on a lot more responsibility or more responsibility than I change their job, which then comes with a different wage.
We've come to our hour. This has been an amazing conversation. Dr. Amy Glassamer, it really is a delight to meet you. I've been following you and your work. I share the calculator almost everywhere I go. It's been an important tool for me. And it just, and there's so much more there linked to the calculator. Great blogs, great articles, great information. And so I highly commend it to everyone. Thank you for the work that you do, and just cheering you on in helping us and in this unusual period of a pandemic and racial unrest and worker rights have all sort of been bubbling forward as a result, and has been a real accelerant to change. And my sister Debbie, it is so great to have you. Just so powerful of a story. And as you continue to get years of continued growth in the organization, I know in Cleveland, we saw more stability and the turnover rate continued to drop. Employee satisfaction continue to go through the roof. I think Dr. Glasser pointed to all of those things, and it really is amazing, but it does come initially with some sleepless nights. And part of that is how we think about ourselves and worth, and all worth weeding through. So livable wage will be part of our challenge. Dr. Glasser, we'd love for you to join us on our Stand Against Racism challenge this year and invite your students to join with us. We'll have a number of big themes that we'll be looking at, including a week on critical race theory, livable wage, reproductive justice, and of course, representation in television and film, all through the lens of gender and race. And it's a very powerful learning. I hope that you all will use it to lead within your own organization and also to have powerful conversations in the community, and that you'll be spurred to activate change. We're a powerful network. So glad you got to have a little snippet of our network today, Dr. Glasser. Really happy to see everybody. It was a great group joining us today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.
invitation.
Thank
Take
you.
care.